The Skinfin Murders is a first edition Pathfinder adventure. When I pitched it, I knew that I had stiff competition, so my primary design goals were to make it stand out from the standard dungeon crawler style in order to grab the player and the publisher's attention right off the bat. I also wanted to make the villain not just be misunderstood, but factually correct in his assessment of the future and have a roughly positive motivation, because I love throwing players a thought-provoking little curveball at the end of the game. I still wanted it to be very accessible though, so I grabbed a theme that everybody in the gaming community is pretty familiar with at this point, and is happily also public domain, the Cthulhu mythos. Key to driving player interest is the title. The title is the first and often only thing that the player sees, so it needs to really grab their attention. Typically, tabletop adventure titles are cutesy and alliterative, and I wanted to nod to that, but also stand out as a bit more serious, and to inform the player that this adventure is a mystery rather than a dungeon slog, and that it's soaked to the gills in body horror so that nobody picks it up for their nephew and gives them a really terrible birthday surprise. I went with an internal rhyme that alludes to the aquatic nature of the adventure, the gross body horror elements, and of course murder for the mystery element. This gives the player a fair bit of info about the general vibe, and also poses some questions. What the hell is a skin fin? It sounds like gross body horror. I'm into that. Let's pick it up and see what it's all about. In a video game, instead of spelling this out for the game master, you handle it with your establishing shots, cutscenes, environmental storytelling, and camera work. A video game gives much tighter control over the narrative and pacing, but a tabletop game has the advantage that the game master can adapt to anything that the players do on the fly, making for a much more flexible play experience. Designing group-focused narrative games like this one is a balancing act of providing cool thematic elements and role-playing opportunities versus keeping the more mechanics-oriented combat players happy. Pretty similar to the balance between cutscenes versus gameplay in a video game. We want to open with enough investigative and getting to know you material to kick off the mystery and ensure that there are plenty of role-playing opportunities, but we also want to ensure that there is at least one combat every session. I expect every party to have at least one player at the table who's super into the role-playing and one who's just there to hang out with friends and punch stuff, and we want to give them both room to do their thing. Role-playing is the primary way that RPGs encourage social gameplay and creative expression. You come up with a super cool ID for a character, you pick out all the little background elements and motivations for them, and then you want to interact with the other characters and the game world as that character. And as the designer, it's my job to create situations that encourage the social engagement and give the players things to react to as their character, while maintaining a cohesive story and ensuring that each player has opportunity to feel central to the experience. Combat is the primary game space for strategy and power fantasy play, and the one that most rewards system mastery. Giving players a chance to benefit from that mastery is key to making the decisions that they make during character creation, like their race, their class, their feats, as well as equipment rewards that we dole out through the adventure, feel like they're significant. Before the game begins, I want to lay out some background for the game master so that they have appropriate tone and motivations in mind for their improvisation. Having to flip to an appendix to consult a chart in the middle of a session can wreck the flow of play, so I want to make sure that the GM has all of this well established before they begin. The driving force of the module is our villain, Norbert Eastham. Norbert is about the most dweeby, unbadass name imaginable because I want the players to hear about this guy and go, huh, that's weird, and not immediately catch on to the fact that he's the main villain. Details should seep into their awareness over time and keep pointing back to the little guy with the dorky name so that it takes a bit for them to figure it out, but the game master needs to know about Norbert's style and motivations right away to be able to drip feed it to the players. To set up the adventure, we have to give the game master room to tie this module into a previous adventure, as this one isn't intended for first level characters. Here I've used the very traditional hook of an understaffed government hiring freelance investigators to go look into something they don't have the manpower to prioritize. When the players get off the boat in Ebbets Hollow, all of the non-player characters they talk to are sullen, suspicious, and probably hiding something. This establishes the general mood of the town, showing the players that they're probably not going to get a lot of support from the townsfolk. We set up the tavern as the most likely place for the players to be able to connect with the locals and look for clues, and everyone here has dialogue that points toward the central plot, but each from a different angle. We've got people arguing about the kids that disappeared in the night, possibly to elope. We have a body that washed ashore that's being investigated by the local constables, and everybody's talking about it. There's a guy with weird giant feet drinking alone in the corner, absolutely failing to come off as inconspicuous. And we have the general vibe that this place was way nicer when the monks from the Monastery of the Mountain would come down and help out the town every now and then, but they don't do that anymore, and nobody knows why. Eventually, the constable drags the newly arrived investigators down to the shore to take a look at the site where the body was found. Here they get into a fight with some giant crabs over body parts that didn't get picked up by the constable when he collected the body. Here, I made a mistake. There's a spell that players of this level will likely have access to called Speak with Dead. Obviously, this could make a murder mystery super easy and very unfulfilling to solve, so I address this by telling the game master that the corpse basically doesn't know anything, that this is a little bit too heavy-handed. The player needs to feel clever for choosing the tools that will help them solve a situation, and Speak with Dead is the obvious choice for this. I needed to have laid out what the victim did know and ensure that it was an appropriate clue to the mystery without giving the whole thing away, instead of just having him not know anything about how he died. We want to allow the players time to check out leads and piece together the story so far, so we leave them alone to do whatever they want for 2 days of in-game time, and then we send an event to move things along. This can just be a fresh new set of clues, or if they're particularly on the ball, it could be their first fight with the Skinfin cult. After this newest clue, we should have the players checking out the monastery itself. This is where they can start confirming some of their suspicions if they have good skill checks. We've got a lot of different skill challenges peppered all over the place in order to ensure that they can start connecting dots, even if they have an abnormal skill distribution across their party. Worst case, the players can totally just attack the monks and then ransack the place for the most obvious clues. This is a very open-ended section, so I've laid out a few different reactions for the cultists based on the players' most likely interactions. They gently try to get the players to just go away until they're confronted with either violence or evidence that they've been found out, and then they try to escape. This is pretty key. The cultists here are inflicting horrible mutilations on the townsfolk, but they sincerely believe that it's in those people's best interests. They know that nobody is going to agree with their methods, but they're explicitly not interested in killing people. One of the most important mechanical elements to consider is how challenging the content in your module is going to be and how strong the rewards that you hand out are. This is particularly tough as an adventure module is intended to be exactly that, modular. So you never know exactly what level the players are going to be and what tools they'll have access to unless you're specifying it's only for first level characters. I defined the expected player level range on the cover as intended for 4 to 6 characters of level 5 to 7. This gives the game master a good idea of what level challenge they should expect from the module when judging if it's appropriate for their group. Based on that, I set all of my skill check difficulties with the assumption that the character making the skill check is roughly level 5, has max ranks in the skill, and it's a class skill for their class, and they have a good associated stat, which will usually give them a +3 or 4 on those skill checks. This means that the expected player has roughly a 10 to 13 on a given skill check, and so we set our difficulty classes to 15 for easy checks that a skilled character will make about 75% of the time, a 20 for moderate checks that they'll succeed about half the time, and a 25 for hard checks where we want them to succeed about a quarter of the time. For rewards, we have both equipment and experience. The accepted cadence is that players generally like to level up about once every 3 gaming sessions, so we use this cadence to calculate the challenge rating for each encounter, which determines the rate at which players gain experience. Harder encounters grant more experience, but a given session can usually accommodate more easier encounters in the same amount of time, so you have reasonable freedom to place the encounters such that there's a good ebb and flow of more and less challenging fights. Incremental experience is the standard for this game system, but when building these sorts of adventures for my own personal use, I prefer to use checkpoints, where the players all gain a level or a skill at predefined times. This is useful in this style of game because it reduces bookkeeping, which can be a significant load on the players and the GM without a computer behind the scenes to handle it for them, and it means that the players have more freedom to decide how they want to play and resolve encounters, decoupled from what action will grant them the most experience. This is particularly helpful given the open nature of a tabletop RPG, because the players may take a ton of actions that lead to them leveling well before the expected time, and then your boss ends up being a pushover instead of a cool climactic battle. Or they might skip over a bunch of content and arrive under level, which in a format with no save and reload generally means the end of that campaign. In a video game, experience grinding is more desirable because it allows less skilled players to effectively lower the difficulty of any given encounter by grinding out levels, allowing them to complete all of the game's content, even if it would be too difficult for them to do so at a lower level. When granting rewards, the key is to give players something that's exciting, but will not trivialize the upcoming content. Usually this means giving them a treasure that is stronger than they currently have, but only a little bit stronger, or only a little bit of treasure at a time. What really gets people going, though, are unique items. Here I have 2 things that are specific to this module: a dagger that steals sanity from whatever it hits and gives it to the attacker in the form of removing mental status effects that the character is currently suffering, and a spell that grants them a lot of the benefits that the cultists enjoy in aquatic combat, but at the cost of bringing the player closer to the same forces that are going to destroy the island. Just a little reinforcement of the "Are we the baddies" theme that we had throughout the adventure. I like how the Monastery investigation turned out on the whole, but I don't love that I didn't explicitly call out the effects of the blue Winnis dust in this trap. It's written out in the base rulebook, but spelling things out is preferable where possible. This project was under a fairly tight word count limitation, and this sort of reference is common, but I'd really rather not have made the Game Master have to look that effect up separately, as it slows down the play experience. The freedom that tabletop RPGs allow for player actions is one of the biggest draws to the genre, and one of the biggest challenges for the designer. In a video game, every possible player action has to be completely designed, programmed, and have bespoke art assets, but here we can rely on the Game Master to flesh things out on the fly if the players go off the rails, provided we give them a little bit of guidance. I included a section here to ensure that the cultists are still around for the players to fight if they get squirrely and run for help, and one for if the players lose the fight in their initial encounter. The cultists are actually primarily interested in helping the people of the village survive the upcoming calamity that Norbert has prophesied will sink the entire island into the sea, so they're going to stick it out for as long as they can to try to save as many of the townsfolk as possible, even if they're discovered. I really like the twisted altruism here, and I think it helps keep the logical thread that they would keep the player characters alive to practice their process on, rather than the more pragmatic move of just killing them all. It also makes a much more compelling proposition later if they're already in his power when Norbert offers them his transformation in exchange for the players leaving him alone to his work. At this point, the players should be able to either return to the constable with the clues that they've gathered, if they manage to collect some without provoking a fight with the monks/cultists, or they can directly attack the monks for a more kick-in-the-door approach. Finally, if they're stuck, the constable will nudge them into a little extrajudicial evidence gathering by recommending they return to the monastery at night, which will give them free reign over the place, as the cultists all retreat into the hidden caverns deep inside the mountain to plan abductions and practice their sutures at night. Again, we want to make sure to catch players who are struggling by having a final, if you can't pass any of the skill checks required to find the clues, go look for a less than secret ocean cave the cultists run their abductions from callout. At this point, the player characters have solved the what's happening part of the mystery. There's some weirdos abducting people and experimenting on them, but they don't have the why part, so we get to dangle that in front of them while they do the hunt the villain to his lair bit. Descending down this huge ladder from well up the mountainside all the way down to sea level, we get to the hidden cave system where the Skinfin cult has been running their catch-and-release program. The players are immediately beset by the aura of madness that pervades the whole space, driving up the tension both by threatening them and highlighting to the players that this is not a safe place to rest. They're going to need to run the whole dungeon on one tank of gas, lest they go mad. At this point, the cultists are defending their home turf, so they're much less squeamish about fighting. We want to present them in a way that showcases the interesting aspects of their adaptations and present unique tactical challenges. The allied sharks and giant octopus help to cement the association with all that is toothy, tentacled, and terrifying in the ocean, and then the cultists themselves are kitted out with skills that help them shove players into the water and then hold them there while they drown. We get this very cool land good, water bad dichotomy in the tactics that helps drive home the overall themes of the adventure, and death by drowning is one that player characters are not usually threatened with and is mechanically quite nasty. Along with the combat encounters, we've also got some nice claustrophobic underwater tunnels, and this totally out-of-place, well-kept library stuffed with journals and notebooks documenting how and why Norbert is doing what he's doing. This part really feels like the key point of the whole adventure to me. The bit where we get to see inside the mind of the villain and see that they truly believe that they're doing a good thing, and that maybe you should come to see things his way. Fighting with the cultists has given the PCs a look at the benefits of the cult's adaptation, and now we want them to see the drawbacks. First we get Norbert's failure, a villager that has clearly died as a result of Norbert's botched surgery who has been tossed to the octopus in the sacrificial chamber. Then we see that nice young couple that went missing in the first act, who are found in the recovery room, as it were, bleeding and delirious with freshly implanted gills and flippers. With these images fresh in their minds, we then move on to the main event. The players open the door to the dungeon's final room to get their first look at Norbert, a small, unassuming man at odds with the damage that he's done. However, he's positioned in a classic medical horror style, elbow deep in this poor guy's chest for some not quite elective surgery. With his hands still covered in blood, he delivers his villain speech, laying out the horrible death that awaits all of the villagers if they're not adapted to life beneath the waves before Dagon comes to personally wipe their little island off the map. He offers the players the same modifications and the fairly powerful benefits that they provide, and then, if they refuse, we see that he's been holding back all of the best body mods for himself as he starts taking bites out of the player characters with implanted shark teeth. Pathfinder and 3rd edition D&D both use player rules for humanoid villains, which means that it's much harder to get what you would think of as a standard boss fight out of them. Bosses in games are almost always big tough guys that soak damage for a long time while throwing out easily managed attacks so that the players can feel skillful for a good while during the fight until they eventually overcome it. Using a humanoid as a boss in Pathfinder like this leans hard in the opposite direction. Bosses' health scales at exactly the same rate that player health does, and so does their damage. This tends to end up with fights among humanoid enemies ending up playing like rocket tag, and that is especially the case when the enemy is a spellcaster or rogue instead of a beefy frontline fighter. Norbert's boss encounter is built to slow the players down in order to allow him to feel like a real threat. He's not a big tough guy. Mechanically, he's an alchemist with the vivisectionist archetype, making him squishy even compared to other humanoid bosses. So I had to make sure to give him a couple of buddies to soak up a few turns of the player damage, a crowd control trap to keep them from bringing everything they have to bear against him right off the bat, and a charm effect that kicks in from the maddening emanations that they've been subjected to hopefully turn one of them, and ideally only one, against the rest of the party for a short time. This is one of the biggest hazards in the dungeon because the delta of removing a whole player's output from the party and then giving that output to the enemy is huge. If more than one player gets charmed and the remaining players don't have some way to counteract that effect, they're basically doomed. In a video game, we would probably include a mechanic somewhere in the boss room that would allow the other players to snap their friend out of the charm effect at the cost of removing their attention from the boss for a little while. A help action or an item they could interact with that would break the charm effect to prevent the entire party from wiping if they roll badly on their charm saves. To focus more on what the players have themselves brought to the encounter and not undercut the very real possibility that they'll lose their fight, I wanted to be sure to allow a flipping of the script here. If Norbert loses, then the players get to go back to town and report their success. They save the day. Yay. Except, after they return to the mainland and claim the rewards from the authorities there, Dagon does come and sink the entire town into the ocean. Norbert was correct all along, although surely there could have been some other way to save the townsfolk if he would have communicated the danger convincingly to someone that didn't write him off as a loony. But if Norbert wins the fight, either because some of the players decide they want to side with him for the power that he offers, because they've come to believe in his cause, because of magical compulsion, he holds true to his word and grants them his boon, allowing them to survive the upcoming collapse of the island. Presumably, several more of the townsfolk are also abducted and given the same treatment between the final battle and when Dagon comes to eat everything. And so more of the town is actually saved by allowing Norbert to continue his work than by stopping him. This was my goal all along, to leave the players conflicted about how they solve the problems presented in the game. I hope to have opportunity to leave even more players feeling weird and conflicted about their choices in the future.